Gildersleeve. I'm VP with IBM's weather business. And it's really a very cool thing to be here today because while those of us have been in the weather business for a long time, the things that we're most proud about with respect to weather are very cool for people that care about data. And what we're going to talk about today is not just how weather impacts businesses, but how cool it is for data scientists to use weather to help your business. And everything we're all about is really important for data scientists. So I think you're going to really enjoy it. Let's talk about scale here for a minute. In the US, there are 6,000 reporting locations for weather. We're forecasting and reporting weather for 2.2 billion locations on the planet. If you want to go to the North Pole, we've got a weather forecast for you. So the first thing to do is we're way more precise. We're creating a specific weather forecast for every square kilometer on the planet. Okay? The second thing to understand is we're doing this at really large scale. So on a normal day for us, we're doing 20 billion API calls about weather. In the most recent set of storms, hurricane landfall storms that we've had in the US, we were doing 35 billion API calls. So we're doing this at enormous scale with really fast latency. So less than 400 milliseconds to get a request from you for the forecast for your location and give you back an answer on the fly with the most recent data that we have. So it's very real time, very on demand, very big scale. During the most recent hurricane, we're serving probably 70 million people were coming in and asking us about weather information in that 1 week alone. So we're used to doing this at a really large scale. We're also doing this kind of globally, and we're doing this with lots of data, and we'll talk to you about how we use that data. Next slide, please. So there's lots of places where you see weather impacting you. So for all of us who fly, 70% of the time when your flight gets canceled, congratulations, you have me to blame for it. Okay. But there's also true, if you look at kind of ground transportation, you look at crop losses, virtually all the crop losses across the globe are due to weather specifically, like hail damage or, for example, at an ag conference last week, I heard about a person who does $50 million worth of blueberries who lost their entire crop because it was too cold the 1 week that the bees were supposed to come out and pollinate the plants. It was an entire weather-related loss. So it's affecting agriculture, it's affecting energy, it's affecting all these industries. Next slide, please. Now, I don't really know how I feel about this slide, and here's why. The great news is that people in the C-suite understand that weather's a big deal, weather's costing these companies a lot of money. They should care a lot about it because it's really a big impact to them. The funny thing is that a lot of companies still don't do much about weather. They treat it as an act of God. They treat it as something that's happening to them, and they'll try to deal with the result of it afterwards, but God forbid we try to do something about it ahead of time, okay? And I implore all of you in the room, there is stuff you can do ahead of time. Next slide, please. So here are some examples. So in the old days, like 5 years ago, when a plane was encountering turbulence, the pilot would report that. The pilot would say it's moderate, it's mild, it's severe. And it was a subjective report by the pilot. Now we're essentially, when the plane hits turbulence, we're recording that G-force, and when it gets to a certain threshold, we get a message down in our dispatch center from every plane that we've outfitted with this software. In real time, we're putting that observation into a forecast model. We're updating the forecast model for turbulence around the globe. And we also know every plane that's going to fly through the airspace that just had turbulence, and we're sending an alert to every plane that just had the turbulence, so they know to divert. Okay? So it's a story about IoT and data coming from a plane, but it's much more a story about, in real time, you can make an observation, decide who it affects, send a notice to the person that can make a difference, have them change their route of flight, and avoid turbulence. And in every airline we've done this with, we've reduced flight crew injuries 50%. Because the people that mostly get damaged in turbulence incidents are the flight crew. The second thing, which is even more interesting in my mind from the aviation space, is this thing about the 11% decline in airline cancellations. Now, any of you who fly, notice now that you're often getting informed about a cancellation before you've even left for the airport, right? That flight is getting canceled like 3 hours beforehand. Where it used to be, you go to the airline, stick around, it's a 9 o'clock departure, you sit around, they say it's going to be 10, you stick around, they say it's going to be 11, stick around, they say it's going to be 12, and then at 12 they say, we're just kidding, the flight's canceled, right? That used to be how they do it, right? Now they're canceling earlier. Now the big benefit of that is, A, they haven't really torqued you off because you're cranky about your flight being canceled, but you're way less cranky than if you've been driven to the airport and then sat through that 9, 10, 11, 12, and then get canceled, right? So customers are happier. The second thing is these airlines all return to normal operation faster, okay? So the reason why so yes, airlines are canceling sooner, but because they're canceling sooner, they have more time to plan to get back to normal operations, and so that's kind of why your total cancellations have gone down. So these airlines have figured out that if you make decisions earlier, you can make life better both for you as the airline and for you as the customer. Next slide, please. Let's talk about energy. So weather correlation with energy demand is only about like 99% plus or minus a point, right? So it's affecting the way you forecast demand. Energy is now affecting supply because of all the shift to renewables, right? It's affecting the energy trading markets, okay? So we serve a lot of energy traders. And we also are now helping utilities understand that, okay, a big storm is coming. These are the regions in your area where you're going to lose homes. The power is going to be lost. Here's how many homes are going to be lost. Here's how many people you should put on standby to be able to repair the damage. And when customers use this service and make decisions ahead of time, on average, power is restored 24 hours earlier than it used to be. Okay? So when you make decisions earlier, you're actually making life way better for people that have lost power. And you've actually turned on the revenue spigot so that their revenue is flowing back to the utility faster. So better for the utility, better for the homeowner. So all this is about understanding weather's impact, taking action earlier, which gets to a better result. Next slide, please. Let's talk about insurance. Now, one of my favorite stories, I went to graduate school in Chicago, but more recently went back there. It's downtown, it's 5 o'clock, and the tornado sirens are going off, and everybody's walking along the street, right? And everybody was ignoring the tornado sirens. Now, I may not be the smartest bulb in the, on the tree, but I think I know that you shouldn't be walking around during a tornado siren. But what that told me, and what we can see from data, is that general alarms that aren't very specific tend to be ignored by people. But if I said to you, okay, in the next half hour, hail big enough to crack your windshield is going to be at the location of your car. When I give you an alert that precise, 52% of people move their car. Okay? Now, insurers can't believe this data to this day, because they're treating claims as this thing that happens to them, and they just have to pay it out, and they hate. All of you know insurers, right? They hate to pay out claims. Okay. In this case, the policyholders haven't had to go lose the time to get their windshield repaired. The claims are half what they would have been. Everybody's happier because a precise alert was given. Okay? So again, this is all about not just understanding weather, but being precise about the location, precise about the time, precise about the impact, and giving you enough time to make a different decision, in this case, moving your car. Okay? The same example would apply to response times. If we know that a severe storm has gone through an area, we can calculate the number of homes that were impacted, and we can be able to essentially tell every insurer, here's how many policyholders were just in the area that got whacked. Based on that number of people, you know how fast you have to ramp up your staffing in your call center. Okay, next slide. Retail. Retail is great, right? What's great about retail is that every place is different. So if it's 90 degrees and humid in Atlanta, everybody's going to the mall because they want to get out of the heat and they want to be in AC. Okay? In Minneapolis, Durjoy's hometown, it can be 90 degrees and humid, and everybody's outside because it's a time to party, because it's never 90 degrees in Minneapolis, right? So the behavior of consumers is entirely different depending on what they're used to in that specific locale. And so to understand the weather impact in retail, you have to understand it context by context by context. There's no one universal rule about how people react to weather. Okay? But we do know that when you take weather into account in showing somebody an ad, you do a weather-triggered ad, in other words, you make that ad twice as effective. Okay? We know that. Okay? We know that if you take that into account for inventory, you can decide whether to put more sweaters from the distribution center to region A versus region B. You can decide whether you should increase or decrease your staffing based on what weather impact will be. There's a lot of things you can do in the retail space. Next slide. And this is just one example of essentially a retail presence that used weather to predict visitors so they could understand how much staffing to bring on for a given day. So this is simply, if you're trying to bring people up to an observatory, if it's cloudy, people won't come. Okay, this is the deep thinking that we do here, right? But what's really cool here is that what we did was take the visitor data, take the weather data, understand exactly what parameters were driving the outcome that mattered, which was visitors, and be able to work backwards to say, okay, so now I understand how to staff looking forward into the forecast, because we know on any given day using the weather forecast how many visitors will come. okay? So that's all essentially data science. Now let's go to the next slide, because this is what is so cool about what we're announcing today. Before I get to this, let's talk about the old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way was that if somebody, let's say you're a data scientist and you're trying to understand weather impact on your business. It's really hard to go figure out what weather locations you're going to try to get the data from, because they're not always right where you are. You don't know exactly what weather parameters to look at. You don't know exactly what models to be running. And this weather data is gnarly. That's a technical term, okay? It's gnarly, and therefore it's kind of hard to manage. And worst off was you had to ship the data to somebody else if you needed help, and a lot of your companies don't like to ship data outside the firewall. So here's what we're doing with the service we're announcing today, okay? We're trying to bring all the precise, and by the way, more accurate weather data that we've collected to a Tableau server environment, okay? We've packaged it up for you so that you don't have to mess and fuss with it. We've done all the packaging for you. The second part is all that machine learning we've used to try to help you figure out what parameters are most important. We've done the heavy lifting for you. In this weather stuff, because the weather parameters are, if you're like Matt back there, you love geeking out on which parameter to pick. But for all of us people that are more normal, you'd rather spend your time doing something else, right? So let's leave the selection of the parameters to the machine learning and to the subject matter experts like Matt, and let's bring the machine learning to you, okay? The third thing is we're running all these algorithms inside your environment so the data never has to leave. Your data never has to leave your environment. And best of all, we're using the same data with the same resolution for historical analysis that tells you what the correlations are and what parameters are important. And we can use that same historical understanding to then provide a forecast of your outcomes moving forward. So now we're no longer just understanding how weather impacted you in the past. We're helping you understand the forecast of the outcome that matters to you moving forward, okay? So what we're so thrilled about is that we kind of think that we've taken our expertise and all the heavy lifting we've done with data, and we're now kind of enabling you to take that power and turn that into all of the dashboards, all the analytics, and all the insights that you have with all the kind of customer data that you own and that you're comfortable with, so that you can spend more of your time figuring out how to make use of the insights as opposed to just kind of doing the heavy lift of doing the correlations of the weather. And because our data is more precise in time and in space, you can get far better correlations and far more accurate forecasts of the impacts that matter to you than if you're using publicly available data. So there's a whole degree of specialization and precision that comes with using our data compared to other sources. I'm going to ask the team now to take you through some real live examples using Tableau.
Great, thanks Mark. So I'm Beth Padera, I'm a product manager with the Weather Company, and so I want to go a little bit deeper on what Mark was just talking about how we're bringing machine learning models inside the Tableau environment. So recognizing your data already lives there, so we're bringing weather to you and helping you choose which business metric you want to look at. In retail, it probably would be sales or foot traffic. In insurance, it would be claims or calls to a service center. So whatever your industry, pick a business metric. We'll match up our historical weather data with your locations, because inherently weather is location specific, and a time period. We usually recommend a couple years of data history so that we can make sure that we're capturing seasonal changes and capturing year-over-year changes as well. And so then once we have all the data in the same place, our machine learning models will train on your data set and our weather data set. And then we'll feed these trained models with our future forecast, so 14-day forecast out in the future where we're predicting not only our weather, but an impact on your business metric. And the great thing is you don't have to leave your Tableau environment. So we're building the plumbing really to come to you and visualizing this back to you in a Tableau dashboard, which is great because you can use the inherent functionality of Tableau to your advantage once we have it in the dashboard. So you can set an alert to say, hey, I want to be alerted when my foot traffic is going to be really low on that day, so I can know ahead of time and make decisions and take action ahead of time. Because we really see that businesses who take action early, like with the airline example of proactive cancellations, saves a lot of headaches and saves money as well. So we have some examples teed up, and we've got Thomas Sandquist here, our sales engineer and one of our meteorologists, who's going to take us through a couple of examples. So the first one is in manufacturing.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. So finally, a meteorologist gets to geek out on the weather up here. So I'm looking forward to delivering that message to you guys today. So as Beth mentioned, we're going to tackle first our use case here in manufacturing and industrial in general. We have worked with a car parts manufacturer where basically they were seeing an abnormally high scrap rate. So they're stamping out car parts, and they were having some issues, specifically during certain times of the year. We'll see exactly what times of the year those were. But the idea here is they came to us wanting to know what's causing this issue. It's indoors, so they weren't really sure that it's necessarily caused by weather. After all, it's an indoor factory. But we were able to help them find some insight, and that's what we're going to dive into here. Thank you, Beth. So the first graphic up here at the top, the first viz here in the dashboard. So up on the y-axis, that's my percentage of scrap rate that the manufacturer was dealing with at their particular location. And then we have the time of the year down there on the x-axis. So notice at the beginning of the year, really no issues at all. It was very, very smooth sailing. But as it pushed further to the right, so as we progressed through the year, once we got into May, June, July, it's when we started seeing those issues. And that really sort of put a light bulb over the top of their head. But they weren't quite sure yet at that point. They weren't quite certain that it was weather related. They thought, hey, maybe this is just a function of how much we were making. So that bottom visual down there sort of debunks that myth as well. So notice on the x-axis, I have a function of production quantity. So, and also on the y-axis, again, we see that scrap rate is really scattered across the board. It really has nothing to do with how much they were making. It was still a situation where that scrap rate was pretty consistent, that it really didn't matter how much they were making. Now, this is where we were able to help them find some insight here related to weather. So we stumbled across a couple variables that we thought might be interesting to look at. Temperature was one of them. Also, relative humidity was another one as well. We were seeing a little bit of correlation there, but overall, we came across one particular variable that really doesn't come to mind. After all, this is an indoor factory. They're not stamping these plates outside, but it was dew point. Okay? So as that dew point was increasing, and that's in Celsius there, notice increasing as I'm going further to the right, and the scrap rate, again, is on the y-axis there. I am seeing that consistent signal where above a certain level, once we reach that inflection point, we do see an increase in scrap rate at our particular factory. So this certainly was, again, that light bulb going off over the head moment for them. They were really excited to see that, it was something that we weren't expecting as we were diving through the weather data here. But it's not only just knowing what impacts we see at our business, it's knowing what we expect, right? So here at the weather company, obviously a big part of what we do is forecasting. So we were able to translate that into something useful for them, something actionable. So notice over the next week, we have dew points hovering right around 0, and this is in Celsius, but hovering right around 0, 1, 2, 3, really a very quiet week is expected for them. But as we progress through time, right around day 12, 13, that's where we saw that increase in dew point, and consequently, they would expect to see that increase in scrap rate to accompany that. So over the next week to 10 days, they're able to basically say, hey, we need to get working here. We need to make sure that we're producing as much as we can while the dew point isn't climbing on us, and hence our scrap rate as well.
Oh, hit the wrong one. Oh, there we go. All right. So our next example is in retail. And so oftentimes the questions we're getting in retail kind of coming from a couple different parts of the retailer's organization. We have one group coming from sort of a corporate level, looking at planning, making sure they're buying the right products, so they have the right product mix, going to the right locations, given the weather occurring at various parts of the country and in points in time. So we know that seasonal changes happen, kind of roll across different areas of the country. And so, down here it's still pretty warm. So if this October day was in Chicago in the 70s, we'd all be out, running around and enjoying the warm weather. Whereas here it's this kind of typical day in the fall. And so people react differently in different parts of the country, and retailers can capitalize on that and get the right products to meet that demand. Then we also have kind of a more granular look at a store. So a store manager would want to know what kind of traffic they might expect, what kind of sales volume, so they can have enough staff on hand. If a storm was coming, they'd be able to pre-order products from a warehouse to make sure you have all your milk, bread, and beer prior to a snowstorm, and not run out. That's always the pictures on the news before a big storm, is the empty grocery shelves. So we're working proactively with retailers to make that not so big of a news story. And so there's a lot of things you can do kind of at a macro level, and then kind of diving into a specific geography as well. So our next example is from a deli, and so we're going to show some Tableau dashboards with that. Oops.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. So this is an output from our weather signals product. What we're looking at is Martina's Deli. We've done this for many, many customers. However, this is just sort of one example that we've come up with here, just to sort of exemplify sort of what to do here with the combination of weather and business data. Now, top left, we have a map. So as Beth mentioned, really it matters where your store location is, right? We always think about weather as these large, high-impact events. Maybe it's what we just see on cable news or in the newspaper, but the reality is what's going on the neighborhood level really matters as far as what sells in my particular store. In this case, Martina's Deli. They have products ranging from prosciutto to pecorino cheese to wines on the shelf, and we're diving into what really helps those particular products sell over these particular seasons. So up in the top right, notice that we have we're in the fall season. So that's what we're going to dive into. Many locations on the map are colored red, so those would be places that during this season we have shown through our models that they are negatively impacted by the weather in those particular locations, whereas the inverse of that would be the darker blue colors, so more positively impacted by weather in those particular locations. Now, over in the top right, that's where I see the various weather variables that matter, and notice that it's not just temperature, it's not just cloud cover, it's not just dew point, it's all kinds of things, such as what is the maximum dew point that I saw through the day? What was my minimum temperature that I saw in the morning? Those kinds of things matter, especially when it comes to people making choices about what they're doing with their day. They're doing it sometimes based upon what the morning looks like, what the afternoon looks like, and that's sort of what we're diving into here weather-wise. And also down on the bottom, this is where we have the various products listed out, okay? So each product we're able to identify that it's not just on a store-by-store level, but it's also the products that can change depending on the weather that's taking place. One particular location that I want to dive into, over in eastern Georgia. So at this particular location in the fall season, we're still seeing some higher relative humidity. That makes sense. It's a more humid part of the country. But due to that, notice by selecting that particular location, those weather variables identify what really matters at that location as from a sales perspective. But I'm also able to identify based upon that information, how many units can I expect to sell of each individual product? And that can be both a positive influence from weather and also a negative influence as well. So once we have that historical knowledge from that information, this is where we're able to translate that, right? It's not just a function of what has happened for these products. It's a function of, now that I have that knowledge, I need to know what I can expect to sell based upon what that forecast looks like. So in this case, we're looking at store I. All my products listed over here on the left. I'm going to choose Pinot Grigio in this particular case. Over the next couple days, I'm expecting normal sales. But beyond that, notice a few days there where I'm actually seeing lower than normal sales that I should expect to see. So maybe those couple days, maybe I move Pinot to the end cap, so maybe I can account for what looks to be less of a demand for that particular product. But then it starts to go up again, so I need to make sure I have the appropriate stock in place to accommodate what looks to be a higher demand for Pinot Grigio there in the forecast. So just a couple examples there to sort of get our gears turning as far as what we can do with the output of our weather signals data and as that translates to business results going forward. So another industry that we've been involved with for a long time, as Mark mentioned, aviation. One quick little visual I want to speak to here having to do with wind direction. So wind direction, as you would expect, is highly correlated with runway configuration. So anytime there is a wind direction change, that's basically means that, in this case, we're looking at San Francisco International Airport, but that we are going to see that runway change, and consequently, we're going to see a change in arrival data. So we have the volume of arrivals and also volume of departures as well that we're seeing at that particular location. So just another example there that I like to highlight of a weather-influenced industry. Another one here, ground transportation, also insurance would be interested in this information as well. I found this one to be really interesting. Notice down in the bottom right, I have accidents, and this is from along the East Coast earlier in the year, accidents as a function of temperature. So notice that, we might think of accidents mostly being based upon precipitation, so maybe snowfall, maybe rain, but this indicates that it's much more than that, right? It could even be just a function of temperature, right? So even in situations where we're not actively getting snow as we're driving, but we could have seen some moisture overnight, and that temperature, as long as it's right around freezing, could result in some black ice, which could cause some accident issues. That was just sort of one thought that I had there that might be a reason for why we're seeing that significant spike in accidents as a function of temperature. Now, heading out of the dashboards here, we have a wide variety of weather data. So we have historical data, current condition data, also a wide variety of forecast data as well, including seasonal forecasts. I'll get to that here in just a moment. But we also have data specialized for specific industries. Ground transportation, we have a travel time forecast. In the energy industry, we have a load forecasting capability. Also agriculture, we have the ability to forecast moisture both at the surface of the soil and also below the surface as well. So just a few examples of some specialized data sets that we have here at the Weather Company. Also probabilistic. So this is another one that I like to speak to, especially at this conference. But probabilistic, it doesn't just give you a number, okay? That's what we call a deterministic forecast, 75 degrees tomorrow. It breaks it up. It allows you to get that insight as to not just what that forecast is expected to be, but also what is really the range of possibilities that I would expect to see, which helps us make decisions that maybe I need to be hedging on, for example. Maybe maybe I'm canceling school tomorrow or something if I get above 10 inches of snow. Well, what is the true likelihood of that? The forecast I'm getting might say 9 inches, but I want to know what is that possibility of me getting greater than 10 inches, and that's where that probabilistic can really step in and help give us that insight. This is an example of our probabilistic seasonal forecast. So sort of a combination here. Seasonal forecast, we're basically forecasting up or down for a particular upcoming season in regards to temperature. In this case, we're looking at precipitation. But it really, again, it is much more than that. We have the ability to deliver a probabilistic seasonal forecast. So while the seasonal forecast might be saying one thing, the probabilistic actually tells us, hey, it's a much greater range that I could expect to see. I'm actually more likely to see less rain than I normally would according to the 30-year normals for this particular location. In this case, this was in Northwest Columbia. So just sort of keep that in mind. We have some really cool products that sort of go beyond just what we've been talking about so far, and we're happy to talk more about them if you're curious.
Great. So hopefully this has given you a flavor that, weather really does impact every business on the planet, all of us as individuals as well, and we're really in the business of helping you make better decisions and uncover those opportunities for your business. So our call to action today, you might have noticed a postcard on your chair as you sat down. We are offering a free trial of our historical data for analytical tools, HDAT, and our forecast data for analytical tools. So reach out to us at biz.weather.com/TC18, and we'll get you hooked up with a trial key so you could start bringing in our weather data that's been curated and aggregated in a way that makes it easy for you to do analytics inside of Tableau. We'd love for you to do that, and so curious to see what kind of Tableau dashboards you can come up with. And also meet with us. So we have a fairly large weather team here, so if you guys would stand up or raise your hand or move around, we'd love to meet with you and talk with you and give you some ideas about how you can start implementing this inside your business, inside Tableau. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts here. One is that we're so excited to bring the weather data to you to make it easy, because we see so much power in not only being able to look backwards and find those correlations, but to be able to make better predictions based on the future forecast. That's really the powers. It's where you're going to see the biggest impact. And the businesses that we see, the clients that we have that can make those decisions earlier are the ones that are really capitalizing on that upside. So with that, I think we have a few minutes to take any questions. And of course, please come up to us afterwards. We'd love to chat with you and see how we can help you uncover weather opportunities in your business. Thank you. I think there's a microphone coming.
Can you provide some more insight on, how companies that are within the CPG industries have utilized this for their, mainly trucking issues, and so for example, we have a massive distribution center in Atlanta,
Sure.
and when a hurricane comes in that area, it completely gridlocks, the U.S. transportation network, and especially our ability to get our, the products to customers.
Do you want to take that one?
So there are interesting things about ground transportation. When, at least with almost all of the trucking firms that I've met with, even large ones that might even employ 50 data scientists, when they're creating a forecast for how long a route is going to take just generally, they are using historical averages. What that means is they're not using any data in the moment, in real time, or any data about the upcoming forecast for the time period of their trip. Neither traffic real-time data, traffic forecast data, real-time weather data, or real-time or forecasted weather data. So the first place I go is to say there are an awful lot of industries like trucking that people are not taking any of the real-time or forecasted data into account in planning their operation. And that will be the first place to start, because it affects every truck every day. And why wouldn't you take advantage of the best data that you have available? I think that's point number one. Point number two is we do a number of products that try to help understand location by location what the specific timing is for each weather along the route. So just like you think about it in an airplane, if you're flying from Boston to San Fran, we're providing the forecast for Cincinnati when you're flying over Cincinnati. We're providing the forecast for Des Moines when you're flying over Des Moines at the specific time you're going to be over Des Moines. We do the same thing for trucking. So there's a lot of data we can bring to bear to help people understand exactly what the context is when they're driving. The last question that you raised, which I think is also important, is we have a probabilistic forecast of tropical storms so that when a tropical storm is coming on board, we not only just say, here is the likely path, but we're actually giving the probability of each portion of the coast to see it's a 2% chance of landing here, a 5% chance of landing here, so that if you're in the trucking business, you can make an educated guess about exactly which of your routes are going to be impacted by a landfall storm and which ones are going to be less impacted. So there are a couple of different places where it comes into play.
Yeah.
Let's tab the case.
Again.
By the way, your ground transportation team is right here sitting next to you.
Yeah.
If you want to talk to Danny, he's right there.
Great. Good. Please.
Hi. So does your data modeling, does it also include other like layerable factors? Like for example, I'm in e-commerce and our running joke is if people aren't at work, they're not puttering around on their computers ordering. So, you know, a major weather event on a Saturday is going to have much less of an impact for us than a Tuesday
Right.
because people aren't sitting at work thinking about how they don't want to be doing work.
Yeah, absolutely. Our models do take in some outside factors. That's a great question. We do take in day of the week. We take in major holidays. And then if we're provided promotional data, if that's part of the data that we help you prep to put in, and we would recommend that in retail, we can factor that in as well. So we know that it's not just a promotion that you ran, but it was really attributed to weather.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I'm in insurance, and we have a special attention to hail. I saw it said on the slides daily refreshes for data. Is that as frequent as the data is in terms of live?
For our raw historical and forecast data, that's we can update that more frequently than daily. Right now, the plumbing that we're building for our machine learning models and the refresh of the Tableau dashboards is daily, but we're working on additional time frames. We're actually looking for sponsor users to work with us on those kind of requirements. So that's great feedback, and we'd love to work with you if any of you in the room are interested in helping us tailor this, for this Tableau community specifically. We'd love to work with you.
And when we're creating a hail forecast, for example, in real time, with that example, the alert I gave you with the 52% moved their car, that forecast is being updated in real time. It's it's being updated much more frequently than every hour, for example, because you're generally going to have maybe 15 to 30 minutes oftentimes is the maximum window you're going to have between knowing that you have a high confidence of that hail event and the actual event occurring. So there's a lot of stuff that's being updated. Most of our forecasts are being updated every 15 minutes. Severe weather stuff is being done even more often on the fly when you can detect a severe weather event because minutes count. There's a woman back here that has been raising her hand.
And I'll just throw out there, I'm the sales engineer involved with that, involved with insurance, so if you want to chat afterwards, I can give you some more specifics.
There's a woman there.
Hi, I'm Kristen. Kristen from Hotel Tonight. I'm just curious, you showed some great flight information. Is the data that you provide to people who work with you, is it just limited to the data that's specific to weather, or do you also share like the historical flight cancellation trends or things of that nature?
We've ended up storing it just to be able to understand the impact of decisions and kind of whether the decisions were right or wrong. So we end up storing that data, but that data is also available from public sources from FAA. But what we found, and it's your lives in almost every business, is you can't make a great decision just looking at weather data. You have to look at weather data, and there's usually 4 or 5 or 6 other sets of data that you have to understand to make a best decision. And so in virtually every one of the industries we're serving, we're trying to fuse weather data with other data like position reports of aircraft, what are the airspaces that have been, that you can't fly into, what are the ground delays that may be affecting something at an airport, as well as the stuff that relates to weather. We've gone far beyond weather because if you care about decisions, you have to care about multiple variables.
Thank you.
We're a large Bluemix customer, and weather data in Bluemix was limited to 3 days of historical. Do you know if that's changed at all? I'm assuming it was
No.
supplied by weather companies. so-
No, that data is supplied by weather company, but there are other ways that we provide data to
Historical?
customers that we would encourage you to explore.
Okay.
So we can talk, Matt can also help sort you out with other options for how to get at the data
Okay.
that are going to be more timely and more, and have just greater data fidelity. So we're creating hourly forecasts out 15 days, for example, but not all that is in Bluemix.
Okay. Thank you.
He's been waiting. This side's been
Making a
so
run.
patient.
Gotcha. So similar to the insurance question earlier, I think there's some of these weather events that have long tails that impact business. Can you guys take our data and kind of help us understand that in more detail? Because like the hail thing, I work in roofing distribution, and we're heavily impacted by a hail event, but it's not all that day. It's that day plus the next 6 or 9 months even. And so it's kind of, you have this severe weather event and then a long tail and then another. So just curious to your kind of thoughts on the long tail piece of it and how to extrapolate that and correlation.
You phone a friend, which means you send you go to the URL, and we'll hook you up with somebody that can talk to you about it over the phone, or if we need to come out and visit, we can come out and visit. Because you're right that there are a lot of nuances to analyzing this data, just like there are nuances to analyzing virtually every data set all of you as Tableau users deal with. And we're glad to consult with you to try to talk you through what we've done, what we know, how we would suggest attacking the problem. Because I think that there's a lot of issues that do come with a lag, or actually the reverse, like how is consumer behavior on Tuesday influenced by the forecast from 3 days earlier? So there are differences in time frame that you need to take into account both before and after. Great point.
Yeah, absolutely. In retail, we've seen kind of the opposite, the future tale of, the forecast when you're sitting here on Tuesday, the forecast for the weekend for a liquor store is really what matters. Whether or not that weather actually happens on the weekend or not is less important than what consumers are reacting to, which is the forecast. So yeah, good question.
Yes.
So I represent a large construction company nationwide, so the right person raised their hand who I should talk to after this. And second question is, you mentioned that all this occurs on our server. What is the impact on that? Is that a refresh? I mean, how does the data get there, and how often, and how does that impact our server's performance?
Oh, Mark Carroll, would you have a guess?
So the answer is it depends.
So we have the smart guy that says that depends. That's why we pay him the big bucks, right?
All right, so connect with Mark afterwards.
Hi, so we've been subscribing to weather data for, I think, over a year now. And primarily we use it for explaining sales performance. And so together with other causal factors, we try to decompose what's attributed to the weather and what's with the other factors. So now we've been using data at the weekly level, and we've found ways to just aggregate the data that we get from you. But I do feel that there's still an opportunity to refine that, because sometimes the impact is just on a single day, but then since we're aggregating for a week, it somewhat gets diluted. And so want to understand, are there any best practices for, I'm using the term aggregating, but however which way we combine the data. And also factors that we've considered. So we took a look at the number of factors that's available, and we found that it's really the delta from the norm that's quite useful for our business. So I guess I want to understand if there are other use cases where other industries have used the delta from the norm, and how other businesses have defined their norm. So for us, we use a 30-year almanac, also from IBM. So if there are other industries that use the same norm or a different definition, would be interested to hear that. Thank you.
Sure.
So that was an awesome 20-part question. So let me try to. Let me try to. I'll try to deal with as many as I can remember. So I think a starting point is that there are techniques that we can talk with you about. If your data is only weekly, there are techniques to try to figure out how to aggregate different weather conditions for each of the 7 days to try to figure out how you would explain the week. And so people like Matt can, and Thomas can really help you with how do you deal with weekly. We are old school in the sense of I really worry about loss of signal when you're dealing with weekly data. And any client we can deal with where you have daily data, we would much prefer dealing with daily data. We think that you lose a lot when you deal with weekly. Now, in many industries like retail, it's actually hard. They don't store the data daily often. They'll store it weekly. And so then we do the best we can. But if you have daily data, daily is better. If you have hourly data, hourly is better. It's amazing how much more fidelity you can get in your signal when you get more precise in time and space. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is we find in a lot of people that are doing your job of trying to explain is weather really a factor or not a factor. They often are looking at year over year. And so they're not necessarily looking at normal. When you're talking to a board, and I've had to do this more times than I'd care to count, boards have a hard time dealing with normal. They don't you can say it's a 10-year climatological norm, it's a 30-year climatological norm, it's the last 5 years trailing average, any kind of thing that's where you're trying to establish what normal means. They struggle with that because they generally are looking at performance compared to last year. And so I would say you kind of have to look that way too. And when you look at last year's performance, you really have to understand how much different than normal was last year, right? Because you have two things going on here. So I guess that would be the only other technique that I would suggest you consider. But our experts can gladly talk to you about how to tackle your problem because it's a very common problem, and we're glad to try to help find signal out of the noise. Other questions? You've been great questioners. Anybody else? Please.
Hi, I work for the river transportation company in Pittsburgh, and I don't know if you have river data like the river flow, the flood stages, the conditions on the actual water, which is for us the highway where we move on. But that would be very interesting to see how the weather affects obviously the river conditions, and obviously the river conditions affects our logistical challenges that we experience every day.
Matt, we can get access to the river data, but we are typically not forecasting hydrological events, which is what you're really talking about. It is a real specialty, and so far at least we haven't chosen to dive into forecasting river flood stage. We tend to rely on the National Weather Service and the NOAA teams to deal with that.
Sorry.
Go on.
Yeah, and just, and who asked the question? I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, so just embellishing on that, we tend to forecast everything right until the precipitation hits the ground. There are some additional analytics we're starting to look at for things like agriculture, so soil moisture, soil temperature, and those types of impacts. But very clearly, and this is getting a bit technical, You have meteorology, which is focused on that shorter term forecasting, but you are seeing meteorology is getting into longer term. So even out 7 months, you can get meteorology signal. You have climatology, which is your long-term trends, 1,000 years, 100 years, and then you have your hydrology. We're focused right now on meteorology, but we're constantly looking for different reasons to move into those other sectors.
Thank you for the question. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Probably a question for you again as well. Are you guys also taking into consideration like socioeconomic status of consumer groups relative to weather impact? Just depending on like the industry and the product, like for example, your hail is a really good reference. I have no covered parking, so for me, not at work, not at home, that would make no difference. But if you're looking at a community where everyone does have a garage, or all the parking's in garages, or even like with retail, like do higher income households care less about bad weather when they're shopping?
So I suspect, like many people in the room, we have access and use a lot of geospatial data layers that have nothing to do with weather, whether it's population or it's socioeconomic stuff or it's housing or land use or whatever. So we do correlations that way, and we do a lot of studying of weather impact on consumer behavior. That's probably our richest data set in terms of understanding consumers 27 different ways because of weather.com and the need to really understand what ad should I serve you based on everything we know about you, not just your location, but everything we know about you. So that's kind of where we're most heavily invested in understanding how people perceive and act based on weather. It's a great question.
All right. I think we're a few minutes over, so we're standing between you and dinner. So thank you so much for attending. And
thank you for coming.
Yeah, feel free to
Thank you.
submit your survey as well on the app. We'd appreciate that. Thank you.